Beat Shapes, Borders Shaping Perceptions of European Societies is a Horizon Europe research project. So we are working on this for 3 years, 14 partners. It started out of a reading group among border scholars during COVID, where we had this idea when there was a Horizon Europe call, let's try this with borders, because the call was more about what shapes our perceptions of societies, of Europe, of ourselves. And then we said, well, borders. We think in borders. We think we identify normally as like Germans, Danes, Bulgarians, Hungarians, Croat. And this is, of course, because of borders and the nation-state system. And this is what we ask people, where you're from? And then usually people say the country they're from. And then we thought, what about the people who are a bit different? And then we had this idea, there should be a work package on minorities. National minorities in border regions, they are often a product of a border that was drawn at one point in history, well, very often after the First World War, where they were split from a country or a culture they belonged to. But they might also belong to this country that they are a citizen of now. But we agreed they have a special situation, so let's look on minorities. Another work package was looking at this idea, Euroscepticism. I mean, the EU is challenged. Many populist parties or parties that want to dissolve the EU, Brexit had just happened. So we look at Euroscepticism. There is a lot of research in Euroscepticism, but what about border regions? Are people in a border region who have this advantage of open borders, which came because of the EU, are they more Eurosceptic, less Eurosceptic? This has not been researched yet really in depth, and so we had this other work package, should be on Euroscepticism in border region. And then some of our colleagues, a geographer, has been working a lot on landscape and borders, border landscape. Border landscape, what do they mean? How can a border landscape be different from another landscape? This, of course, leads into nature, environmental protection too, like pollution does not stop at borders, so border landscapes are important. If we want to protect them, we need to cooperate across the border. But they can also have a story in heritage, like in heritage history, our common cultural heritage on a border landscape as heritage. I mean, from Denmark, Germany, I can say that the oak tree is very important in German mythology as a national German tree, whereas the beech tree is a Danish national tree. So this idea of planting beech trees and oak trees on the border has actually been something that happened in the Danish-German case. So these are the 3 working packages where we have been doing empirical work, where we were out in the field and altogether worked in 10 different border regions in Europe. Work package 4 with the minorities, and this is a very interesting location we are in here. We are at the memorial of Joachim Mohr, who is a well-known Hungarian writer from the 19th century, so at the time when nationalism, national identity also played a role. And we are now, and this is his favorite place, he's born in this town where we are now, Komárno-Komárom, which is now a twin city with a Hungarian and a Slovakian part. We are on the territory of Slovakia, but we are on an island in the Danube River, Europe's longest river, which has been a river connecting. And then this writer had his famous place on this island, just on this in the river, in the Danube River, which now is part, or since the First World War, when the Habsburg monarchy was dissolved. Before it was not a border region, but now it has been like the border between Czechoslovakia and now Slovakia and Hungary. And in the city here, people have to. Many people have a Hungarian heritage. There's a strong Hungarian minority. You can see that they have a bilingual inscription here in Hungarian and Slovak language. It's an interesting place for us to do research in the work package 4, minorities, where we look on minorities and their national minorities, often a product of border regions, and how they relate to European societies, to Europe, to themselves, to the region, and what role the border plays. And what we will be doing here later today is also a workshop with students from the Hungarian minority, where we will have them reflecting on how the border matters in their lives, actually. And this is, of course, COVID, but it's also today. How does it still matter? What is their stories? What have they experienced when crossing the border, or how the border interferes into their daily life?
Our research so far indicates that everyone really appreciates the openness of internal, it's important to add, the internal EU borders. And a lot of people cross on a daily basis, whether it be for shopping, but also for job seeking or even dwelling. And there are some concerns of the borderlanders in the area, as we learn, that are not particularly specific to the region. So when we ask them about what they make of Europe, they come to think of bureaucracy and the green transition, some effects of it, especially in rural agricultural areas. They feel that farmers are too overburdened by bureaucratic procedures. Then there is the EU's reactions, some of the EU's reactions against the war in Ukraine, which is perceived by not a few as, not the right answer. That it's the sanctions against Russia are hurting EU countries more than Russia, and so these group of perceptions are not specific to the borderland. Indeed, we find such attitudes across many regions in Europe. But what is more specific is that the southern Slovakia hosts a quite large ethnic Hungarian or Hungarian-speaking minority, and they are concerned, on the one hand, about a national investment policy, in a way ignoring the region or not paying sufficient attention to it. So the poor transport infrastructure, and even some major companies, when they come to Slovakia, they avoid these southern areas. So they are suffering of high unemployment rates and economic underdevelopment as compared to other parts of the country. And then there is the issue of minority language use rights, which is popping up from time to time, also most recently. So this is another major concern. On the one hand, in the context of Hungary and its neighborhood, it's this infiltration or sort of cross-border campaigning activities. I mean, many people in southern Slovakia are consuming media coming from Hungary, to a lesser and lesser extent, but still it's quite strong. So there is on the one hand the infiltration of Hungarian mainstream political narratives about Europe that also infiltrate some of the or most of the neighboring regions, Hungarian inhabited regions around Hungary. But then also in the case of Slovakia, so right now they also have a government which tends to be more Eurosceptic, and then this is sort of shared across ethnic communities or linguistic communities. And it's interesting that in more recent elections, actually many minority Hungarians in Slovakia no longer necessarily support the ethnic Hungarian party, which used to be the case for a long time. But they are turning more and more toward Slovakian, other Slovakian parties, which gives a polarized picture. Yeah, so some are supporting pro-EU political forces, and others are Eurosceptic ones. So it seems that we are coming to a gradual, I mean, there are limits to ethnic-based politics, right? Because maybe more and more the ideology is more important than the ethnic vote. So I think that's an important phenomenon that we already see. What research shows so far is that borders still matter, and primarily members of minority groups identify as, for instance, Hungarians from Slovakia or Hungarians from Romania, rather than just solely Hungarians or as Romanians or Slovakians. So it's something unique about this.
És itt a nyelvekre kitérve volt egy pár cikknek a címe, amit így kiszedtem. A két himnusz nem tudsz egyszerre énekelni. A második az a kiszivárgott a nyelvtörvény módosításának tervezete, és nemrég tudtam meg én is a nyelvtörvény módosításokról, és nagyon nem örülök neki. És kopik a magyar nyelv Szlovákiában, ami meg csak szerintem simán szomorú.
A zine is short for magazine, and it usually refers to a self-made small publication or booklet. Zine making is a practice traditionally used for groups that are marginalized or alternative, a little bit outside of society. But nowadays it's widespread, very popular as a way of free self-expression and getting messages across in a cheap, simple and easily reproducible way. And even it is used as a research tool increasingly. In the B-Shapes project, the workshops that we designed together with the URAC team are targeting participants that are 18 to 30 years old and are belonging to national minorities that live in European border regions. And these participants can take part in the arts-based research themselves. Through these creative activities, we are exploring the questions: how do they see the borders? Is it something that connects cultures, or is it something that separates people from each other? We are exploring how deep the border runs in their communities, and also how does Europe come into the picture.
This is the situation of my community, starting with 1912, 1913. And I ask you if you know about the Macedonian question.
I mean, I feel like Flensburg and Schleswig-Holstein in many ways is part of this northern hemisphere, I think. I think there's a strong connection historically, obviously, but also culturally there's so much interaction between Danes and Germans that I feel like it has a very unique space in like the north in a way, where like you have this connection between Scandinavia and then Central Europe in a way that comes straight through this border region. So in that way I feel like we are kind of part of Scandinavia in a way, but in some way we're almost in a transitional stage, between Central Europe and Scandinavia in that way.
Többiekhez hasonlóan úgy érzem én is, hogy kicsit elveszett az emberek között. Nem vagyok szlovák, emiatt hátrányban vagyok, de ha átmegyek Magyarországra, azért érzem, hogy magyar se vagyok. Már csak abból is kifolyólag, hogy máshogy ejtem mondjuk a szavakat, vagy esetleg használok olyan szlovák szavakat, ami nekem már idézőjelben magyar, de ha átmegyek, realizálom, hogy ők azt nem értik, hogy én mit beszélek.
Common thread that I could identify is maybe pride in their own minorities' culture, responsibility to present it to the rest of the Europe and preserve it, but also the keen openness to share, to explain, to make others understand. It might be a border region, but for them it's just crossing the road, it's crossing a field. For them the borders don't materialize that way. It's rather something that exists in culture, something that exists in media narratives.
A következő oldalra a Komáromot választottam, és azt az idézetet írtam, hogy ki gépet száll fülébe, annak térképet áll, és nem tudja, hol lakott itt Vörös Marti Mihály. Ez ugye nem tudhatom verse Radnótinak, amiben azt írja le, hogy más nem tudhassa, hogy számunkra mit jelent az otthonunk, csak mi igazán. És az utolsó oldalon egy kis magyar zászlóval Széchenyi Istvánnak volt egy olyan idézete, hogy sokan azt gondolják, Magyarország volt, én szeretem hinni, lesz. Ezzel zártam a kiskolómat.
Let's start a really strong dialogue with the European Authority and the member states.
És az EU külső határai szerintetek minél inkább ellenőrizzék, vagy az is legyen inkább szabadabb, vagy attól függ milyen irányba?
Ellenőrizni. Arra emlékszem, Egyiptomba mentünk, akkor akármennyire idegesítő volt, hogy szó szerint 9 fémdetektoron mentem át, 6-szor áttapogattak, hogy biztos egészséges vagyok-e. És a podgyászainkat, mindenünket legalább 7-szer átnézték, de úgyhogy ki is pakolták és vissza. Szóval az egy darabig eltartott, mire átnéztek minket a nyaralósra, hogy rendben tényleg bejöhetsz. És az is nagyon szívélyes volt, hogy a reptér területét elhagyva elmentünk egy szöges drótos kerítést, ahol a út mentén volt egy gyönyörű szép tábla kivilágítva, hogy üdvözöljük Egyiptomban, ugye angolul, alatta meg egy páncélautó, egy cikás egyénekkel. Szóval családbarát.
A külső határai az tragédia. A Frontex összes emberét kirúgni és átadni a hatáskört a nemzetállamok kezébe.
Itt pedig hangsúlyoztam azt, amit szeretnénk elérni, hogy le a határainkkal, a korlátozásainkkal és a különbségeinkkel, hogy ne legyünk ellenséges szomszédok.
Work Package 5, Landscape, Border Landscapes as Heritage. This is also, we have not been doing work in this border region in that work package. We have some limitations into our resources. We had to decide, should we have all 3 work packages in the same border region, or should we have more border regions, and decided, well, we cannot, then we would have just said like 3 or 4 or 5 regions. We wanted to have 10 or at least some more. So we have humans kind of created landscape by planting different trees, by creating certain landmarks to mark that this is kind of ours and the other part is not. This is what Work Package 5 is looking in. And then also having people there, we have a very interesting method, what we call border walks, border landscape walks. So we go into the border landscape and ask citizens from the border region who live there about if they have a specific landmark which is on the border or near to the border, where they would like to tell us a story of what they have experienced with it, what it means to them.
Så grænsen har jo, og i og med, at vi som børn, så legede vi jo på området herfra, og så til, i hvert fald til Borg. Vi var hele tiden bevidste om, hvad der var på den anden side af vandet. At der skulle vi ikke hen, og kom der nogle tyske toldere eller grænsegendarmer, så puttede vi os som regel. Plus at dengang var det jo nemt ligesom at kende forskel på, om det var en lokal, der kom. Nu kom der en mand før med trækkende med en cykel af udenlandsk udseende, og så ligger det jo straks i mig, at det er en overløber.
Ja.
Så i dag er det jo lidt sværere med alle de mennesker, vi har fået ind i landet, og så sige, at han hører nok ikke til her, eller hvad. Så skal man begynde at kigge på kropssproget, om folk nu kigger sig rundt for at se, hvor de er. Og sådan. Okay. Men den der umiddelbare reaktion, den er der stadigvæk.
The intention with this material that we are gathering is that we are making a digital map. So we will actually publish the stories on a digital map where the public or everybody can use these maps, and they can click on links in the borderlands that are part of the work package. And then they can see the sites that people have been talking about. There's going to be images of the sites, and then we connect the stories that people are telling about the sites.
It was a strange experience, actually. borders because I didn't expect it to be so, I would say, adventurous. So walking in the jungle, sort of. But it was my idea actually to try to do this border box here in Knäred because it's a historical border. It's not anymore, since more than 400 years, it's not anymore a national border. So I wanted to understand if this border still matters when it comes to Danish versus Swedish. But it is a border at the same time. And because the border, the same, how to say, same border has so many meanings on so many levels. It could be, once was a national border, now it's a border between two counties, as I said before. It's also a border between two areas owned by different people or municipalities and stuff like that. So that was something that struck me today, that one border could have so many meanings.
And the takeaway from that, I would say, is that borders are multi-layered constructions and have multiple meanings. So for this border between Sweden and Denmark, the one-time border 400 years ago, today is a border in Sweden between two landscapes. And as such, people really relate to that. So they know that this is where Halland, the region where we are in now, ends, and that is where Småland begins. But they also tend to know that this was the border between Sweden and Denmark. But it's like over-layered between these other administrative bordering and divisions as well. Denmark is not, it's been a long time, so it's not something that is very strong in habits or in culture, but interestingly you can still find traces of it. So we have talked to people who live in farmsteads which bear a Danish name, for instance. So the Danish expression of something, a squirrel in that case, has been kept for all this time, at least according to the folklore of those inhabiting these places. The people that joined us also could give examples of dialect expressions that have borrowed or used the exact Danish expressions of things. So there are linguistic traces of this old border. The border itself as a physical element doesn't look the same today. So even though it's marked in the landscape, the stones that we see today, the rocks with some vegetation on it, was actually not placed there at that time, but later. But there are some bigger, larger rocks that still can be seen today, and the stretch is really evidence as being the same as earlier. So I think that is really interesting and reminds us about how borders move and how many people throughout the history in Europe has been affected by those changing borders. And when they change, they still leave traces behind.
I Småland, fast hon var hallänning. Jag kan läsa lite om henne. Här bodde då Inger-Lena Persdotter, hon var född 1853. Känd som Lena i Egråsen. Stugan hon bodde i var belägen på en mark tillhör en gård i köpet, som jag sa. Och rättsligen tillhörde hon alltså inte Egråsen, men även var hon skriven där. Alltså hon tillhörde inte här eftersom hon bodde där. Men hon var även skriven på den här sidan. För att få lite inkomst gick Inga-Lena den långa vägen till Laholm. För att delta i ogräsbekämpning på Stora torg. För det var ju sådana kullerstenar som låg där rensa för hand. Och fick några väl kronor eller någon öre för det. Det var en tröttsam vandring här uppe från ända till Holm. Så hon fick mat och kaffe ner hos kyrkoherden i Knäret så hon kunde vidare. Och Lena flyttade till ålderdomshemmet härifrån 1941 så att hon var här ända till 1941. Och någon gång därefter 41 rev stugan helt så den försvann helt. Och jag kan väl säga att de som gick härifrån och då till, det var ju fler från folk från hela som gick då skulle ogräsbekämpa, alltså i Laholm. De bodde på Kungsgården.
We had one interesting border in that work package, which is the Öresund, like the Danish-Swedish, which is a sea border. So it's the sound going between Denmark and Sweden. It was only a border since, only the 1650 something. So it's already some 400, almost more than 400 years now that it has been, not almost 400 years that it has been a border between Denmark and Sweden. But before it was not, but it's and then you can see like monuments, especially on the Swedish side, that this is now a border. There is a castle on the Danish side in Helsingør, which is supposed to be the castle King Hamlet from Shakespeare lived. It's not in reality, but this is still an important landmark for Danish too. When a ship comes sailing in by Kronborg Castle into the Copenhagen harbor, this is, when we look at old stories, this is not just old, even today, when the Danish Navy comes back from fighting pirates off the Somali coast, and then they sail along past Kronborg Castle. This is still something important for the soldiers that are coming home.
I think we made, I don't know, six border walks on the water, on the ferries. And we did what in Swedish is called tura. It means touring, that you go on the ship in Sweden, for instance. And then when you come to Denmark, you do not leave the ship. You stay on board, and then you can just cross how many times you like, actually. And you can stay on the ferry, and you can socialize, you can eat, you can drink, you can talk. And that is a big tradition, at least in Sweden. When we spoke to the Swedish pensioners, they all had sort of experiences of doing it since they were quite young, or even they went with their families to Denmark to do the shopping I talked about before, to buy cheap things. The ferry, and also the border, become like a space, like a place that is moving. I mean, I heard so many stories about people who had parties on the ferry. It means you don't have to rent a place for a party. You just went on board of the party, then you celebrated, I don't know, New Year's Eve or whatever, So it was very, very convenient. I thought when we did the trips with the Danish pensioners, their stories were a bit different, actually. They didn't have this touring tradition as much as the Swedish pensioners said. They went to Sweden to do shopping, to visit friends, to go to cultural events. When we did it with the youth, we crossed with the ferry with Swedish high school students. I think it was 6 or 7 of them, and they told a slightly different story. Of course, they had been touring. It was also a tradition, but for them, Denmark wasn't a foreign country. It was just a place that were very close by, that you went when you were 16, for instance. It was this tradition to go to Denmark to get drunk, so because in Denmark you can buy alcohol when you're 16. In Sweden, for beer, you can buy it only when you're 18. So by just crossing the strait, you can sort of get access to alcohol. But we were also talking about the idea of building a tunnel or a bridge between Helsingör and Helsingborg. And at least the Swedish pensioners were pretty much against the idea, because it would ruin the experience of taking the boat, so they didn't want that. And those from Denmark said it would ruin Helsingör as a city, because there was a big highway in the middle of the city and train tunnel and stuff like that. They didn't want that. And when Sara and I wrote an article, about the Öresunds region, what struck us actually was that people in this area, they thought about cooperation that was across the Sound, Denmark or with Sweden. They didn't really talk about the greater Europe or the European Union or anything. We talked about what is good for the Öresunds region, not what's good for Europe or anything. They didn't really mention that, or I don't know if they are.
So it's obvious that people feel very strongly an Scandinavian identity, and that this identity is stronger than the European EU one. Of course, the national identity, being Danish or being Swedish, is even stronger. But they all feel a lot of having a lot of common and being joined by being part of the Nordics. And that has consequences when it comes to how people engage in the European Union polity as well, in the way that they engage with elections or various common policies for the European Union.
If there's a football game with Sweden against Denmark, of course you become Swedish or Danish. But if you're Swedish and there's only Denmark in the World Cup, of course everyone will support Denmark. So we have this kind of Scandinavian brotherhood, sisterhood as well. Because the conflicts that used to be between the countries, very strong and very, very bitter conflicts, they are so much in the past, so they don't matter anymore.
I think it's interesting, this tension in modernity, that the boundaries of the individual is supposed to be so flexible, and we can deal with it and we can develop and all the time, and it's kind of imposed upon us. But at the same time, we have these very, very set societal boundaries that we are not allowed to touch them, right?
The suggestion came from our colleagues at EURAC that they had been working together with an artist collective who are also doing things about borders. So Lungomare has engaged artists, and unfortunately we only had money for 2 art projects. One was happening in the Polish-Czech border city of Cieszyn, the border city. And the other one was done on the Bulgarian-Greek border, a Turkish border, in this triangular border region, which is of course a very conflictuous border region, and also partly being an external border of the EU, it raises a lot of other issues there.
We are working as one of the partners of B-Shapes, and work on a series of site-specific artistic productions, which reflect on a public, individual, and a spatial narrative, and try also to give borders a diverse understanding, and trying also to open up the understanding in general of borderlanders and also of the borderlands itself. At the Czech-Polish border, we are working with artist Zorka Wolny, and the premiere was in the beginning of October during the Border Festival. And at the border triangle, Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, we are working with local artists from Bulgaria, Boris Mizyakov, Georgy Bogdanov, and Ivan Mudov. And we invited a Turkish artist, Ezra Ersen, who already addressed in her previous works this specific borderland and the role, also the history of the Ottomans in this specific border area. And we also invited one external collective, Zimmerfrei collective from Bologna, from Italy, to work on this specific border, since it's always interesting also to bring together more, like, let's say, people who are facing this border and who face this border in the present, but also in the history, and also a position which has a kind of distance also, and which brings other experiences from the borderlands into this specific area.
I think to this project it really can add these different publics, and it can add a wider view and a more creative view on the topics, and also maybe how different futures can be imagined, and still really going to the core of the things and taking a clear standpoint. I came to Cieszyn first time, not the first time ever, but first time for this project in January. Then I was here in April and in May again. We collaborating with Krytyka Polityczna here in Cieszyn, which is very lively and very socially involved place. So they could also be our research partners, introducing us to interesting topics that are really happening around. And together we gather around 10 people to work about it. We asked them to write some Polish-Czech fairy tale, but we also had an exercise of writing like political postulates for the region, and we also read news from the local newspapers while creating the piece. And there was also a series of sound workshops and vocal workshops. So the final piece it took a form of vocal performance, sound piece, sound play. But of course, it was also important to have a Czech perspective on the topic. And I was lucky to find a kind of a local composer on the Czech side.
Já jsem napsal text na jednu celou scénu, protože se zabývám i psaním poezie, takže jsem se snažil napsat text, který by znázorňoval v rámci poezie a jakýchsi hesel nejenom koncept hranice česko-polské a hranice mezi zeměmi jako takové, které jsme měli znázorňovat, ale hranice tvorby, hranice těla a mysli, hranice, jakékoliv hranice, které si představíte, a ty jsou zobrazeny právě v první scéně českého textu, toho bukletu, který vyšel k té hře. A přes výňatky ze hry Antona Pavloviče Čechova Racek je tam symbol, že hranice vzdušného prostoru narušilo Hejnoradsku.
Cieszy to nie korporacja, którą można zarządzać kosztem jednostki uznawanych za słabsze. Zależy nam na tym, by każdy czuł się bezpiecznie, a jego potrzeby były brane pod uwagę w dyskusji publicznej. W przeciwnym wypadku doprowadzimy do będącej urodą cukierkowej wizji miasta, którym tak naprawdę nie da się żyć.
So we were moving in between the very universal and abstract language of voice and using it in a different ways, like harmonic melodies to noise to abstract sounds, and the text that belongs more to the language that you understand or the language that you kind of familiar with but not fully understand it. So that was for sure the effect on working on the border, that we could play with a libretto in two languages.
Quand j'étais chez mon père, ma luron lurette, ma luron lurette. Quand j'étais chez mon père.
Work Package 3, Euroscepticism in border region, is a very challenging one because there was an impression or a narrative that people in border regions are very pro-European. Suddenly, some election results showed that Eurosceptic parties were very successful, especially in border regions. This is the case with the Front National, Rassemblement National in France, which has been quite successful on in this deindustrialized Lorraine region, which borders Luxembourg and Germany. The Danish right-wing Danish People's Party has been very successful in the Danish-German border region, which was always considered to be very pro-European, especially on the Danish side too. So this is kind of, okay, perhaps we have been a little bit naive in believing that border region residents would be more pro-European or pro-European integration than people in other regions of the country. So this was why we said, okay, we need to look at this.
I think one of the causes of this Euroscepticism roots in the kind of government of Europe. Peoples are convinced that the European policies are made to a standard from Helsinki to Sevilla, from Brest to Potsdam. And people are sure that this standardization, globalization is against the cultures, probably also against the languages. That is to and this is for me one of the great challenges. Can we be European and also very careful to preserve our identities?
So we're a team of 6 different universities in Working Package 3, and we're examining the French-German border region as one where there's a long-standing history of reconciliation and friendship and European integration. We're also examining the Danish-Swedish border region, which has also long been integrated, but not so much in a European context, more so in a broader Nordic context. We're looking at the very interesting Slovak-Hungarian border region, which I say this is very interesting. They're all interesting, but because of the large number of Hungarian speakers in South Slovakia, so there are ethnic and historical links across that border. And finally, we're looking at the border region where I'm also involved in the fieldwork, which is the Polish-German-Czech border region. So this is the border triangle where those 3 countries meet. What we've done for each of our 4 border regions is that we have first of all examined regional media, print media, newspapers from each of our border regions to analyze how over a period of 5 years newspaper narratives have developed and changed about the other side of the respective border, the people there, and the meaning of all this in terms of European integration and the European Union. The second thing we've done is that we've zoomed in on the 2024 European elections and carried out interviews with candidates and campaigners from our border regions in the 2024 European election campaigns. And the third task is that we're trying to bring the citizens back in by carrying out focus groups in each of our 4 border regions, each time on both sides of the border, to gauge what people who live in border regions, and especially young people who live in border regions, make of all this. We started out in this project thinking that there would be a very distinct link between border regional situation and local narratives about the border, about the neighbors, and Euroscepticism. We had good reasons for thinking that, because to a great extent, open borders and the ease of crossing them has to do with European integration processes. But actually we found that the narrative link that people make between living in a border region and the experiences there on the one hand, and European integration and the EU on the other, is weaker than we anticipated. It is there. It sometimes manifests itself most clearly in a sense of disappointment. How can it be, people were writing at the time of the COVID border closures, that borders are closed in the year 2020 in Europe? But the link is actually weaker than we anticipated when it comes to the leap from local conditions, open borders, ease of travel on the one hand, and attributing this back to the European Union on the other. People don't tend to make that link quite as strongly as we had thought they would.
Quand j'étais chez mon père,
I'm working together with a postdoc here in Strasbourg, and our first surprise when we did our media analysis, focusing on regional newspapers from each side of the border between France and Germany, was that we actually did not find any signs of Euroscepticism, and this was very different with regard to other border regions. For example, mainly the border region between Poland and Germany, where you could see a lot more Euroscepticism. So we can already identify some differences between different border regions. The surprise, it was a surprise for me, for the Franco-German border region, from the point of view of the media analysis, because I myself live this border every day. And for example, during the COVID crisis, I sensed much more problems between French and Germans living at the border. There were aggression against cross-border workers, Alsatians on the German side. We talked in history about the coming back of ressentiment, resentment against the neighbor. And so for me it was a surprise that the regional press actually depicted, even during the COVID crisis, a very positive image of the neighbor and of the European institution. What I can say from my personal experience of border walks here at the border between Strasbourg and Kiel, well, that when you cross the border with the students and to discuss with them everything on both sides of the Rhine, you can actually follow up from the history, the development from two enemies towards reconciliation of France and Germany, that you can literally see at the border. For example, in front of Kiel, you have a statue of reconciliation, and we have a friendship bridge. But it only has been opened in 2004. So after the Second World War, there was not much friendship between Strasbourg and Kiel.
We asked to our partners to try and get real people, local people, people from the border region, either Germans or French. And well, we discussed things. We wanted to know how they felt about Europe, how they felt about the European Union, to know what difference existed between Europe and the European Union, what they thought about their relationship towards their neighbors on the German side or on the French side. And it was fascinating, really was. And if you want to know a secret, we had slightly more Germans than we had French, and the French started talking in German, and the Germans started talking to me in French. And in a way, this is one of the way of understanding our border region.
I would say that each time when I discuss my work as an academic, my work on Europe, this project, my other projects, there is this question: what are the solutions to Euroscepticism? And I always refuse to answer it, because posing the question in this way it is treating Euroscepticism kind of disease, and people who are Eurosceptic as a little danger for democracy, dangerous people, maybe you should avoid them. And I always said that Euroscepticism is as old as the idea of Europe, and it will be always, as long as Europe exists, we will have Euroscepticism. We have to accept the fact. This is objective phenomenon, it will be there. So for me, the condition of democracy, of a good democracy, is a system in which we can talk to Eurosceptics, understand their concerns, very often refuse, of course, their solutions, but it should be debated openly.
We are a nation with specific national character, which was described in the novel Švejk. It was written by Jaroslav Hašek, and it is a very famous novel. I recommend you to read it, to understand our values and attitudes. And we simply like our comfort in our country, which is surrounded by mountains and hills, and we do not travel much, and we are not so interested about the situation behind these mountains and hills.
So you're the hobbits of Europe now.
Yeah.
The way you describe it, I mean, it's
this comparison to hobbits, you are not the first. Yes.
I think it is not a disease that we can get rid of. It is something that we must treat as unwelcome guest, but a guest that will be in European house for always, probably.
Probably not hiding the problem, attacking, allowing for dialogue, reflecting on the role of border regions in Europe. That could be interesting with more citizens' dialogues. Maybe we build too many institutions, too many projects, too many formal procedures, and we lost a little bit the contact with the citizens and their expectations. And then on the other hand, it's quite amazing that a lot of citizens are not aware on what Europe already did and what Europe is not responsible for, but member states not changing law, for instance. Take administrative law, it's still a national competence. We don't have a competence at the European level.
Quand j'étais chez mon père, Guéma Luron Lurette, Guéma Luron Lurette. Quand j'étais chez mon père, Guéma Luron Lurette, Guéma Luron Lurette.
There's a lot of communication that is needed because we're dealing with so many different border regions, and it has to be somehow the work that we are doing has to be somehow correlated. And I mean, we constantly need to, arrange workshops and communicate in order to get this to work, actually. I think this is maybe the biggest challenge in a project like this.
I think the most difficult challenge was to overcome this narrative of being pro-European. Because here we're in a region which is so different from the others, as we just said, because also, well, this region was, before Germany even existed, this region was German for 1,000 years. Then the French invaded this region. Then the German invaded it again, then the French again, then the Nazis, and then the French took over, and we were relieved because of it. And because of all of what happened, people are definitely in favor of Europe. Yet they do have some feelings, and they do think that some things are far too expensive for them to afford, and that some policies, some migration policies and stuff, are not well in tune with what they are aspiring for. And in order to really connect with them, we had to help them get rid of that very polite varnish of saying we are pro-Europe. And we had to make sure not completely without manipulating them or anything, but we had to make sure that they were really speaking out their truth, their real experiences, the administrative things that really affect them, and the troubles that they sometimes face, in order to be able to have a real portrait of what Europe is in the border region.
For sure, the most challenging border and experience is the external border, which is involved, like the European external border, so the borderland Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, which is involved in B-shapes. This is a challenging border since you feel really, okay, there is a fence, and this fence does define a space, and I cannot go through this. I cannot pass this fence, and you know that. Also what kind of tragedies are connected to this fence. The experiences of the artists from the border will be weaved into the historical parcours of the museum. So that will also be quite interesting and challenging, also how you bring a present narration of the border into a historical narration of Bulgaria.
My main impression from the journey is how open are people to strangers. We talked with people from different ethnicities, and spending more time with them through this project was also mind-opening, and I truly appreciate the fact that I had the time to see that how together they are, how warm they are with each other and with us, how warm they were with us, and how willing to help us, and how excited about cameras and camera crew being present there. And of course we were shooting on film, and we were using very old cameras, like from the 80s and 70s, thanks to Ivano, which was amazing with them. And that brought up their interest even more, because it's like the camera looked like something from past centuries.
I'm not going to share stories about smuggling things to Turkey, because it's not good for the business. Even though I could share one. I have this series of works which is tap water, so I always bottle some tap water from my studio, and I make a label that it's tap water and the spring is the artist studio. But later on I decide to make rakia, so I produce rakia, like homemade, and I put them in a small glass bottles from mineral water, and I have a brand of my rakia which is called Goa Voda, which means naked water in English. And so it looks really like a mineral water, so I have like let's say like 30 bottles. When I go into Turkey, I always have this water with me for friends and for nice time. So it's one of my works which are really practical works which I use in my everyday life. It's not written rakia anywhere on the label, it's written Goa Voda, and then because it's 40 degrees, I write it with words, not with numbers. So because the custom policeman, if he sees 40 degrees, that he might be suspicious, that it might be alcohol, so it's written on Cyrillic, so I'm clean. The only way to catch me if you open it and try it, but who wants to try a mineral water? Hot mineral water, because usually it's the summer, so for the water it's important to be cold. For a key as well. They invite me to do a project for B-shapes, so they gave me some guidance lines and some time to think about it. So I'm still in the process of thinking what exactly I should do. So I make some research on the border between Bulgaria and Turkey and Greece a little bit. I met there a guy who, during the socialist time of the country, he was a director of the national park Stranja. So he's quite a guy who knows a lot about the region, about the nature, about how the things are going there. So I invite him to make a walk there and go for mushrooms. So this is something which is the best thing when you walk. It could be the best thing when you walk, because you look in your food and you're looking for fungi. And this is something which don't recognize the border. So for me, that's the starting point. That because the fungi, they have like a really remarkable underground system. So it's in Bulgarian it's called mitso. I know the Latin names. I used to know it like before the interview, but it's not anymore in my head. So this mitso is like really like a system under the ground, which go from both sides, and it's very important for the ecosystem. So, and the mushrooms actually it's like their flower, so I would like to go with this man to make a walk and look for mushrooms. And during that time, I will discuss with him and come with ideas like to do some interventions in the museum here in Sofia, the National Museum of History, which is very classical institution. So it's very difficult to do something which is out of the way they like to function. So it will be very challenging for all of us to do something here. Porcini. You know porcini? It's the tastiest fungi that you can imagine. So I don't think that we will find this one as well. So, and there is another one which is called Červena muhomorka, so it's a poison one, so probably it will be full of that. So it's actually the most recognizable and famous mushroom in the world, because everywhere you see in the children books, it's like these red mushrooms with the white dots. So actually it's quite hallucinogenic. So eating it, so it's considered it's like a very poison mushroom, but actually it's just it's used in many places to get high. I spoke with this man, and he told me that there is a parallel border, something between 1 kilometer and 10 kilometers away from the border, deep in Bulgaria, which is like a second border which was built during the communist time, like a fake border. So because a lot of East Germans was coming here for a holiday, and they were trying to escape in Turkey or in Greece. And this border, they were crossing the border and they was thinking that they're in Greece, but actually on the other side there was the soldiers, and usually they were killed there.
We started digging around this topic, and we realized that, first of all, nobody knows how many people died trying to escape on these borders. There is absolutely no precise record. It's probably several hundred, but nobody knows exactly how many. Because the thing was that for many East Germans, there was a popular saying that the border between Bulgaria and Greece and Bulgaria's Turkey is not so well guarded. Not like in Berlin or the border between East and West Germany. So quite a lot of people from Germany or from Poland or from Hungary came as tourists to Bulgaria and were trying to cross the border. But what they didn't know is that actually if the border is here, 3 kilometers before that you have a fence and actually a border fence. And this zone, 2-3 kilometer zone between the fence and the actual border was actually the most heavily guarded area. So many of them were crossing the fence and they were happy that they are finally free, but actually this was exactly the spot where they get caught. And it was a very weird thing that for the border guards, which were mostly kids, like 18, 20 years old, very often they preferred to shoot on the spot instead of captivating these people, because for a captivated person you get like a small award, you get a couple of days of leave to get back home. But if you kill somebody in a skirmish, if it was really dangerous and you had to kill the trespasser, then you got like 1 week of leave. So it was just a very tiny difference between life and death. And we realized that there are several monuments to border guards who died on these borders because, well, with Turkey and with Greece, we had problems with Greece in the 40s and 50s. And there are several monuments to border guards, but not a single monument or something to remind of all these hundreds of people who died on these borders. So we decided to think of a first imaginary monument or memorial for these people. And we actually, what we'll show in the exhibition is a model, a proposal for such a monument that we hope to actually build close to the border. And actually our work for this project is a series of photographs of all these areas close to the border or the actual border, which were used for trespassing, that we photographed in infrared film, like large format negative 6x12, because this infrared imagery, it gives you slightly surreal landscape, or it's it's both real and fantastic, and we are planning to insert in these images, to insert objects or some symbols of these people who were at one point at these places. This tree is just 20 meters from the fence, from this first border fence. And sometime in the late 70s, 80s, the border guards were so crazy that they found somewhere a skeleton, a human skeleton, and nailed it to this tree. It was it was enclosed in a military, some kind of uniform, and it was nailed to the tree just to scare people off. And these bones were there until like 2011 or 2014, when finally they were taken away. And we were there with a local historian who remembered seeing this as a kid. And let me find. And he made us a drawing. Maybe I'll show it later. He made us a drawing of how it looked in 84, 85 when he was a kid. So our first round of shooting was around the village of Chepinci, which is in a few kilometers from the border. And actually, this is the outskirts of the village. And these are the remains of the gate that was protecting this 3-kilometer area before the border. And actually the village ends more or less here. There is a house in 50 meters from this place with people still living there and remembering how they had, every day they needed a special permission to cross this gate and go work in their fields. What is strange for us is the attitude of the former, attitude towards the past, because most of them, like ordinary people, they are not very happy with what was going on back then. But on the other hand, very few of them want to talk about it, because there is still this kind of pride that, okay, the border guards were heroes and they were protecting our country, and they don't, most of them don't like to say anything bad about the past.
It's been very, very fascinating for me how it seems as if it's really important for people that they come from the borderlands. I think that's been one of the most fascinating parts of the results. Actually, is this that the people who are telling their stories, it's very obvious. It actually means a lot to them, right? And there's a lot of like personal emotions involved when you are talking, or when they're talking about this, or telling the stories that they're telling. So it's not just, you know, official stories. It's official stories that are somehow related to their personal experiences, and often also, I think, actually very emotional. Also, you know, family stories about traumas, etc. And I think it's been really fascinating to see how people, at least the people that we've been talking to, how they are actually, they think of the borderlands as being part of their identity, right? That these are places where they belong, and they're kind of, you know, also different from people from the mainland, so to speak. That this fact of growing up in a borderland or living in a borderland actually makes them something special in relation to other people in a country. And I think this is something that is it's really fascinating, that it means so much for people. And also that they have this impression that they are, you know, different from others. They have experiences that are different from other people. These experiences are mainly, I think, related to, you know, aspects like war and conflict. That is very much part of the borderland stories. That there's always something, even though it's far back in history, there's always something that is related to war and conflict, and having, you know, family stories about being in conflict. And then the transitions, the border transitions, right? So that you might have people in your family that have not moved in terms of moving a nation, but they have actually lived in different nations because the borders have moved. So it's not something that has so much influenced sense of belonging to a national community, but it's influenced which country they've been living in, right? Which I also think it's very interesting and fascinating, and of course different. And then I think that there is also a lot of stories about having cross-cultural competences. So being aware that a borderland is a land with at least two different national cultures, but often also the presence of more different cultures, and having this ability to actually, navigate the different cultures, often also related to languages, right? The use of languages, and you have knowledge of at least two different languages.
I think for Euroscepticism, it is true that it has not necessarily the same image at the border as if you look at the rest of the European Union, or look at it from a global European point of view. Because as from what I can judge here in this border region, I like to talk about this border region mainly, is that there's not only a Euroscepticism due to a rejection of Europe or European institution, but also due to a frustration that there is not enough Europe. Because if you cross the border, in the border regions, you cross the border very often. And sometimes it's just to go shopping on the other side of the border, but sometimes it's also to do common projects. And the more you cross the border, the more you realize that there's still so many borders that have not disappeared. You have freedom of movement, but a lot of administrative, political, cultural borders persist. And this can be very frustrating when you want to make believe that we have European integration, that it doesn't matter if you're on the German or the French side of the border. And so Euroscepticism can be a feeling that we have not achieved enough Europe. And this is a message also to the European Union to say, listen, there are people at the border, usually they're very pro-European because they profit from the mobility. They are all for Europe without borders. But if you frustrate them too much with your regulations, with your administrative borders, if you give them too many problems at the border, they will no longer believe in Europe. And who is going to believe then in European integration?
What is kind of the main idea with the B-Shapes project? It's to ask this question about, okay, how do borders actually influence the perception of European societies? I think it's extremely interesting how in these narratives that we have been, gathering in the work package on border landscapes, the EU and European integration is extremely absent. So, I mean, you have, of course, a lot of stories that connects with there being open borders, right? And people seem to generally appreciate the fact that we have open borders, and also it's criticized a lot from the side of borderlanders that there is a reintroduction of border controls, right? I think this counts for almost all of the borders that we are engaging with, that there's kind of a turn as well maybe happening with Corona, maybe a little bit before that, and it seems as if people are very critical towards it, right? That this is not the way it should be. It should be open borders, etc. But it's not connected with European integration, and it's not connected with Schengen, which is actually part of the whole story, right? That we wouldn't have had it without this, level of political, the politics that have actually made it possible. So I think this is really interesting that it's also telling us that the EU hasn't managed to actually, create this story. The EU hasn't articulated this story. I mean, when people are not in any way, connecting the open borders with the EU, then the EU has obviously not managed to articulate that it's somehow part of this process. And I think this is really interesting. It's too late for the EU to tell this story, because it seems as if it's turned now. So it's going to be part of the heritage rather than the past heritage, maybe.